Hi, I'm Virginia from Right Clinic, and here with me today is Katya. Thank you for being here today, Katya.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Thank you so much. So today we are going to talk about Katya. So Katya is a performance coach specializing in job applications and interview preparation. And she supports job seekers across a range of industries and at all career stages, including those planning a career change. So that includes you if you're listening and you're thinking about switching to medical writing, or maybe switching from being a medical writer to being an agency owner. So all of those kinds of questions are things that you can ask Katya about. So Katya, how did you get into doing this?
Well, I had a roundabout route into getting into performance coaching. My career started in medical after my physiology degree in medical publishing and then medical communications, both of which I got into by accident. I don't recommend that way of getting into a career, but I found it kind of both of those experiences both very fulfilling and very just brilliant, but actually quite frustrating. But it took a redundancy to actually give me the push to go and do what I really wanted to do. And that's when I went and retrained, became coach. And initially the plan was to do performance coaching. I was thinking about people in their workplace and help them with their roles and the skills that they need. But actually over time, one of the things I realised is that some of the key skills that we need to progress our careers are actually the job application and interview skills. And they are not developed in the workplace. Nobody's employer will help you with that. And it's actually very difficult, I think, to develop those skills through books. And there's masses of information, advice, tips. We all do it, the top 10 tips of how to do this for your CV. But actually, that's a really difficult way to build skills. So eventually I moved more into coaching for job applications and interviews and really trying to think about the skills that underpin those. It was like a skill set, and the sort of skill sets that job seekers can develop in order to then be able to compete for the roles that they want and make the career move or, make changes, promotions and things like that. So kind of that's the path that I had. It's circuitous, but it's been a very interesting one.
Amazing. So can you describe one of the biggest problems that people come to you with and how you normally help them solve that? What's your technique to help them with their problem?
That's a really good question. I think the most common sort of questions are around the do's and don'ts of things like CVs and cover letters. So, and I think it is because there's so much advice out there, but actually a lot of the advice, I feel very frustrated with it because it's very prescriptive. Use action words. You put in metrics. You must have achievements. You must have this. Don't have more than one page on a CV. Have more than one page on a CV. And I think when you try and follow that sort of advice, it's very difficult to then think about the task you're trying to do, which is to convince an employer to select you. You get so focused in the details of how many bullet points can I have. You're focusing on the wrong part of the problem. So when somebody comes to me and they've got a problem with a CV or a cover letter, my first approach is the job spec. Everything for me begins and ends with the job spec. But actually thinking about the skills and how to analyse the job spec, thinking about your achievements, thinking about your in terms of performance and evidence. So one of the things I try and do is work with the individual, not just to say, oh no, you must have 4 bullet points, you must have 3 bullet points, but actually saying, why do you want this job? What are your strengths? And actually building up the confidence that way and the skill. Because it's actually, if you think about job applications and interviews, it's just a set of skills and they're learnable. So I think once you learn them, then it's not so scary. And then some of these questions go away because you can have 4 pages of a CV if that's what you need, but it's not worth it if you don't need it. So, it takes away, I think, a lot of the questions that people have.
Yeah, and I think like you said, I would definitely agree. There is a lot of advice that is conflicting. So do you have one page or do you have 2 pages as a CV, or how long should a CV be? But like you said, it's as long as it needs to be, as long as
Mm.
it meets the job spec or job specification. So do you normally then give them feedback on how to change it so that they actually learn that skill, or do you go away and edit it and ask them to edit it and then you do a side by side? What's your kind of technique?
No, it's very much the person I'm working with retains control of the writing. And that's really important for two reasons. One, not introducing, I mean, the worst thing is to walk into into an interview not 100% confident about your CV, because that's where you'll fall apart. If you get asked one question about one bullet point that you're not sure about because somebody else has written it in a certain way, then that destroys any chances in an interview. So for me, it's feedback. It's taking often one step back first. Let's look at the job spec. What are the clues here in the job spec? What are the bits you're worried about? What are the bits that you're strong about? What does your CV reflect those strengths? Very often, in chatting to somebody, even just talking about the job spec, we'll discover something that's really important that's missing from the CV, and they just haven't thought about it because we're trying to. Quite often, the approach is I've got to try and think about my career and what I did and how I did it, and then actually using the job spec to start with. Oh yes, I remember, this is something that's really important to me, or, actually this is the bit that I really love about my job. And then we look at the CV. Well, let's see, actually you showing that in your CV. If you're not, it's a really easy change. And actually, one of the things I love with my job is when I see the transformations. I mean, really, and the word transformation is thrown about a lot, but what I see is transformative. And suddenly the CV will come back to you and think, oh my God, where did this come from? But it came from the first step that's often missed, which is, understanding what's being asked of you, and then thinking about your performance and your abilities in terms of skills that you can then put onto your CV.
Yeah, I think often maybe people feel under a lot of pressure to try and put in a job application as quickly as possible, rather than actually sit down and think about it and make it the best that it can be. Because I definitely, and I'm wondering if you agree. Would you say that it's better to apply to a few jobs with a really high quality specific CV rather than sending out the exact same thing, as brilliant as it might be, but non-specific to like 100 different job applications?
It is, isn't it? But it's very difficult. If somebody's desperate for a job, and I know it's very easy for somebody to sit here and say, oh, you must do a few tailored applications and focus your time, because then if they don't get it, then there's that disappointment. But there is a benefit in firstly understanding if you really want the job. And I know there's always this balance between I need a job and actually I really want this job. But the more you can convince the employer, I really want this job, the more likely you are to stand out from everybody else. So there is a benefit in the long term of that strategy, however tempting it is to just think, well, if I've done 100 applications this week, I've increased my chances. And quite often I see on LinkedIn comments about, 1,000 people applying for the same job. And I think it's very easy to fall into the trap where you're competing with 1,000 people. But the chances are you're not competing with 1,000. Most of them haven't got all the requirements, or, they're not suitable for the role. So trying to keep in mind you're competing with the 5 or the 10, which are really good. That's who you're competing against. And the only way you can compete against those 5 or 10 that are really good is to put in a really good application. So I don't know if that helps, that sort of mindset shift, if it helps anybody there, don't think about the thousands and the hundreds. Because I guarantee you, anybody I've spoken to that looks at CVs, the good CVs jump out at you. They absolutely jump out at you. And I know that quite often there's the statistics are, a recruiter will look at a CV in 7 seconds or 5 seconds or whatever the number of seconds it is. And it's very easy to think, well, I'm being dismissed easily. But in those 5 or 10 seconds or whatever it is, the person who's looking at that CV is desperate for that CV to be the right one. They actually really want to find a good CV. So anything you can do, or the good cover letter, anything you can do that gives you that chance, you will stand out over the hundreds of other boring ones that they've just seen that, just gets into the no pile. So I don't know if that's helpful for your audience, just to maybe it'll shift the mindset a little bit about how they look at things like CVs and cover letters.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I think also it would apply to any kind of message that you send to someone, especially, it's going to be your first contact with them. And if your first contact is a CV, then, that's something that you spent a lot of time on in comparison to sending a cold message to try and connect with someone, or sending a cold email. You've got less substance there to work with. But with a CV, you've got a lot more that you can demonstrate. So it's worth taking that extra time. And so what would be one of the top questions that people struggle with in interviews, and how would you recommend people handle that?
Oh, there's a couple. There's lots. I think every question are the ones, and they I think they fall into different. For me, they fall into different categories. It may be helpful to be the sort of categories of questions. So one of the sort of the general questions around fit and motivation for the role. Tell me about yourself. The little sort of summary type of questions. Or just sort of generally, why do you want this role? Where you're inviting somebody to talk about why they want that role. So it's very useful to there's lots of books that give you examples of questions like this. So the information is out there. I'm a little bit less confident about the answers that they give, but certainly the types of questions that you can practice, it is worthwhile preparing those. And then my advice is, don't try and memorize an answer. Try and memorize the key points you want to put across. And that's much easier because the chances are you're going to get the question in a different way to how you expected it. And I think if you've memorized an answer and you get the question in a different way, it can throw you completely. So that might be something, don't worry that it doesn't matter if you go off script. Don't think, oh my God, I wrote down this answer and I'm saying this answer. The point of preparing is to give yourself a structure. And then the other types of questions are what they call behavioural or competency questions. And that's very much based around the job spec. And it's about trying to provide evidence that you meet the criteria for those particular elements. And almost when you're looking at those questions, I would say use the job spec. And imagine your interviewer with a checklist saying, has this candidate provided sufficient information to demonstrate their ability to do whatever that requirement is? And that's when you've given enough information in your answers to be able to do that. But as I say, it's very likely that in some form or another, the interviewer will be assessing the questions the answers that you're given, and seeing, because in order to be able to compare against other candidates, they're going to need to assess whether the quality of your question provided sufficient evidence. So think about those types of questions as providing evidence. So I think that's probably. Then there are
great.
Then there are the sort of the tricky questions, which are, I don't know whether in this industry they do them, but if you were a P, what sort of P would you be, or something like that. I mean, I think there just have to go with the flow and decide whether, the type of culture that asks that type of question is the type of culture that you'd like to work in. I'm not quite sure there's a way around those sorts of questions.
Yeah, I think sometimes there are some psychological questions that you can't really prepare for, but you will just hope that the other answers are the important ones, and then these are kind of just extra. So hopefully they don't judge you on the quality of those answers, which might seem quite abstract.
Yeah.
So I think that was a really helpful tip.
Interrupted it, but for me, that's very telling about the organisation. So use the interview as a two-way process. What are you learning about the organisation? Not just what are they learning about you. So if you have an interview that's asking you lots of wacky questions, you have to think that that's the type of person that they're looking for, or the type of environment that you'll be working in. So for me, it's a two-way. Sorry, I interrupt you. There's a two-way flow, I think, in an interview. And don't forget that it's as much your opportunity to learn as it is for the employer.
Yeah, that's so true. No worries. I think it's so good to actually reiterate that you are there to learn about them as much as they are to learn about there to learn about you. And like you said, you know, if their behavior during the interview is not something that you would want to receive while working together, then maybe you're not a good fit. And that interview is kind of a great way to help you decide, you know, between another job that you might be more interested in. And again, every interview and application process is a learning experience.
Yeah.
So you should also try to evaluate what you think you did well, and, you know, regardless of whether or not you get the job, and how you felt afterwards. And I've definitely heard that some medical writers, you know, will have an interview and they'll just sit there and be talked at, and they're not really asked any questions, which is quite unusual. But, you know, don't go for that kind of job if that's not the environment that you want to be in. So I think you need to be quite selective. So thank you for bringing that up. It's really important to, you know, prepare some questions that you might want to ask your potential employer or potential client. So what would you say is a good question to ask a client or an employer at the end? Because I've been asked that question so many times. So.
I'm going to sound like a broken record. Use the job spec. But for me, it starts with the job spec. Is there anything in that job spec that raises any? That's the first part. Is there any aspects that raise any questions for you? Those are the ones that you have to ask, because if you don't ask them now, it will be very difficult for you to then assess whether or not you want the role. So that's the first element. Go through that and say, is there any element? Then is there any element of what I've been told so far that I don't understand, or may impact whether or not I want this particular role? It's always nice to try and find out about the culture. If you don't really feel like you've got a handle about the culture, some people are lucky because they know somebody who works in an organisation that can find out through the back door a little bit what it's like working there. Then I think it's a really good idea to try and, if you haven't been given that information, if it hasn't been shared, try and discover, you know, how do you work together as a team? Can you tell me a time when you've worked together on a difficult project? And when things went wrong, what happened? Trying to get a sense of what is this place going to be like to work in, I think that's your opportunity. And one of the final points I'll make on that is that actually, I think one of the biggest things that you can do is demonstrate to the employer that you want the role if you want the role. And I've been in scenarios where maybe somebody's choosing between two candidates, and there will be this, you know, I'm not sure if they really wanted the role. So I think, you know, if you really want the role, you need to make sure it's clear that you would accept the role if it was offered to you. And if you get to the later stages of interviews and you're still not sure if you would accept the role if it were offered to you, there's two things. One, you need to think about the types of roles you're going for, the way that you are assessing your interviews, because then that means something's not quite going right, but also it increases your chance of you not getting the offer. And in my experiences, even worse than being rejected is being rejected for a role you actually didn't want in the first place. And I can't tell you how many times I've had, you know, clients get really upset, partly because they've actually been rejected for a role they didn't actually want in the first place. So I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but I think, you know, the interview process is really an opportunity to be thinking about not just whether you want the role, but then going back, and you said about assessing, am I actually going for the right sorts of roles? If it keeps happening to you, you know, what is it about what you're going for that you're missing, or what are you missing during the interview process that perhaps isn't giving you the clarity that you need at the end?
Yeah, I think that's really an interesting point that you've raised there, because sometimes I get messages which are saying, oh, I've applied to every entry medical writer role or every associate medical writer role, and I'm constantly rejected. And I think that it's nothing wrong with you. It might just be that there are other candidates who might fit the role better. So you might be more suited to maybe a more senior role because of your level of experience. Or maybe you're not quite ready to be a writer yet. Maybe you could go into content management, which is how I got into it. And then maybe even editing or reviewing. So, would you hire a doctor as a associate medical writer? Probably not. But would you hire them to review? Yes, more likely, because they've got the technical medical knowledge. So it might just be trying to find, like you said, the right job that you can actually fit into, that people actually want you to be in. And again, it goes back to the job spec, doesn't it? Actually really look at the qualifications, because you can be overqualified for something, which means that you might demand a higher salary, but that's not in their budget. So you also want to be given fair value for the job that you do.
Exactly.
And so so I guess that brings us on to the final question. What's next on the horizon for you?
Well, for me, actually, the opportunity to provide education and free advice, I think, is something. I started doing it with Peter Llewellyn's careers events and activities. Back in, I think, 2008, it was when we first started doing things, and I really do enjoy that. So that's one area for me, whether it's through Peter Llewellyn's events. I also do something with Women's Network Bloom, where I do mentoring. And then through LinkedIn, being able to post advice and thoughts, and maybe thinking that mindset, more the mindset changing type of advice. But one of the areas that this year I'd really like to focus on is this idea of careers as a skill set. And what I notice is that 90% of the time when I'm working with somebody, it's on a live project. So there is a skills building element to it, but it's always limited. It's limited by deadlines, the time somebody has, the capacity they have, their level of stress, and it always has to balance between, we've got to get this done. We can't just have an exercise in skills learning. It has to have an output by a certain time. And over some time now, I've been thinking that really these sorts of skills need to be developed when somebody has time and there's not the pressure of job applications and, interview coming up or job application coming up. But often we don't do it because we're busy with other things. And actually maybe creating a community or a newsletter or something that starts talking about those sorts of skills and how you can develop those. They take time to develop. Might actually be a really interesting element. So if there's anybody in your community who would be interested in that, whether they're a job seeker now, you're always a job seeker, aren't you? Whether it's for this job or for the job in 2 years' time or 3 years' time or your next promotion, it doesn't actually stop. The career progression and these skills are career-long skills. And if there's anybody that's interested in this idea of building these skills through their career rather than waiting for these sort of crunch points, then I'm going to do a newsletter sign-up sheet. I think you'll include that if you could. And to get in touch, I'll be really interested. And I've not quite worked out exactly how this is going to look like. But if they want to find out more and keep in touch with me that way, then I think that'd be a really interesting thing to do.
Yeah, fantastic. So it's really nice that you're going to share even more free advice. And I'd definitely like to invite you again to share more about how that's going and other top tips, because I know that the kind of landscape of medical writing is always changing. So there might be, different kind of interview techniques or even, medical writing tests and things like that. So I will leave a link to Katya's LinkedIn, so you can follow her on LinkedIn and follow all of her lovely posts with free advice. And also a link to sign up to Katya's newsletter, which I'm sure will be full of free advice as well, that you can keep in your inbox so it doesn't get lost on LinkedIn. It's always,
That's true. I was going to say, a couple of times a week I have availability to do some free consultations as well. So if anybody wants to reach out for that, if somebody's interested, they think they might be interested in one-to-one coaching, they're not sure. A good way to start, I think, is to get some advice and feedback. I have limited spots, but that's also something that's a possibility.
Yeah, great. I'm sure that's available on your LinkedIn profile, right? So that will be a link down below. So again, follow and check out her LinkedIn profile. And I hope that you enjoyed this episode. And thank you again, Katya.
Fantastic. Lovely to speak to you, Virginia. And well done for all the work that you do as well in terms of such an important thing, education and helping people be informed about what they do in their careers and things like that. So that's really good. Well done.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I'm really grateful for all the people that have helped me. So this is my way to kind of give back and help others as well, and hopefully people to help each other, which I've seen kind of
Exactly.
happening. So I'm really happy about that happening. And yeah, hopefully everything else goes from strength to strength for you as well. And yeah, of course, you're now part of the community. So thank you so much for all your advice again. And I'm sure we'll catch up again soon.
Lovely to speak
All
to
right.
you.
See you then. Bye.
Bye.